Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher for Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University. Well, hello everyone and welcome to Fish University. We have a great show today. I am here with a couple of professionals in the fisheries world that do work with one of the toothiest critters that swims around. We're going to be talking about gar today, and specifically we're going to be talking about alligator gar. One of the folks we have today is Matt Wegener. Matt, why don't you tell us about where you're coming from?
I work at Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. I'm with their research branch called the Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, and specifically I am the project leader of the Garson Point Aquatic Research Laboratory located just outside of Pensacola, Florida.
You work at Garson Point. You know, that's funny that we're talking about gar today. It has nothing to do with the fish, right?
Nope, nothing to do with the fish, just what this part of the county is called, Garson Point.
In full disclosure, Matt and I actually worked together when Matt was doing his master's degree at Mississippi State University. I was part of his committee. He got to fish for his degree, and it was a good way to go, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. We got to share a number of hot Mississippi summer days out there in a 10-foot plastic boat trying to catch bass over and over and over again.
And also today I have with me Kayla Kimmel. And Kayla, you are with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and what you do?
Sure, Wes. I'm a fisheries biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the Baton Rouge Fish and Wildlife Conservation Office. So within the Fish and Wildlife Service, we're a fish and aquatic conservation program. Do fisheries research on threatened and endangered species of fish, any aquatics or invasive. So they keep us busy, that's for sure.
Cool. So the reason why I asked both Matt and Kayla to come on today is our professional society is the American Fisheries Society. The Southern Division of the society has a technical committee that's totally devoted to the conservation and management of alligator gar, and both Matt and Kayla have served on that committee. I think both of you have been the chair of the committee at some point in time. So I've asked them to come on and talk about alligator gar because it's a really neat fish. It's oftentimes a misunderstood fish. And if you've never experienced an alligator gar, if you've never been to an aquarium where they have alligator gar, they're just a neat, large fish that is really charismatic and really worth seeing. Well, guys, again, welcome and thanks for coming. Now, a lot of folks have heard about gar. A lot of times we think about gar being one species of fish, but it's not really. We have multiple species. How many species of gar are there?
I know that there are 7 living species of gar, 5 of which are found in the United States. But those 7 species are the long-nosed and short-nosed spotted gar, Florida gar, and alligator gar. And then there's the Cuban and tropical gar. So 7 extant species.
So they're only found in North and South America. Is the tropical gar in South America, Central America? Do you know?
It's found in the same general area, I think, as the Cuban gar. We've got a few of them that pop up here in Florida, mainly because they've been raised in the aquarium trade and then let go, but specifically down in the more Central America for the alligator, for the Cuban and the tropical gar.
What makes a gar a gar?
Generally, just by looking at them, they usually have a mouthful of teeth and their body is covered in armor, very heavy scales that Native Americans have used for a long time for a lot of other purposes. Generally speaking, they're cylindrical and long, and the length of their snout is a good way to tell the difference between those species. And they can also breathe air because they have a type of swim bladder that allows them to actually control their buoyancy by inhaling and exhaling atmospheric air.
So then they're relatively primitive or ancient fish as well, right? They've been around for a long time.
Yeah, the late Jurassic period, like 215 million years ago, I believe Kayla quoted us here on. She likes to say they actually swam with the dinosaurs.
That's what I love to say. It gives people the visual of how old this species really is when you picture this same fish swimming with the dinosaurs. So yeah, they're definitely an ancient species. It's been around a long time.
It's fascinating when you think of things on time scales like that. I was having a conversation with someone last week about the Appalachian Mountains. And I said, do you realize the Appalachian Mountains were formed before the dinosaurs walked the earth? They were formed before the rings of Saturn. You know, it's hard to imagine that, but they've been around a very, very long time. Kayla, we want to talk today about alligator gar. What makes them unique from other gar species?
When I think of what would differentiate an alligator gar from the other gar, the first thing that jumps into my mind is their size. They are the largest of all the gar species, and they get so big, it just really sets them apart. They can grow over 8 feet, 9 feet, even historically, they have seen 10 feet long and over 300 pounds. To me, when you think of how an alligator gar is different, just really by their sheer size. And then, of course, like their fast growth when they're little, they grow so fast. Yeah, so to me, that's a few things that just makes them different.
Regarding their size, I mean, a lot of times fishermen tend to confuse alligator gar with other species, and we may get into that later. But when anglers start comparing the size of the fish relative to the size of their boat, they're talking about an alligator gar at that point. When I looked, on one side of the boat and his tail was sticking out one side, and I looked on the other side of the boat and I could see his head sticking out the other. When the fish is wider than their boat, we're probably talking about the same species, and that's alligator gar.
Wow. And they're pretty long-lived species as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, the oldest on record, I think, is around 99 to 100 years old. That's a fish that was caught in Mississippi. That's the world record fish. It was 327 pounds, I believe. Just talking with Kayla earlier, and we had a fish here in Florida that was 112 pounds, so not nearly as big, but was aged back to a year class in the 1950s, and that was just a couple of years ago. That was a 70-year-old fish. It's like one of the oldest alligator gar that's been documented. We're over here kind of on the eastern range of alligator gar as a species. And so we see a lot of differences in their size and their growth, but they can get just as old as anywhere else.
So they live for a long time and they get quite large. Now, it's interesting to me that you said that the fish in Florida was only maybe a third of the world record size, but probably 60 or 70% as old. Yeah, I assume that their growth rates vary by the environment that they live in, and a lot of that's probably has something to do with food. What exactly do alligator gar eat?
Usually what is the most abundant is what we assume. We're not blessed to have extremely large populations of alligator gar here in terms of numbers of individuals, so we don't really sacrifice them or kill them to be able to see what's in their stomach. So we come across dead alligator gar kind of opportunistically, and we always take a look and see what's in there. And most of the time it's empty, but we have found croaker and mullet and some of our freshwater sucker species. But I would say overall tend to feed on what is the most abundant, slow-moving, large bait fish that they can find. But they'll eat anything. If you look in the literature, I always like to say that they've found leather boots and parts of a diesel engine, along with birds, grackles, things like that. So they will eat anything that they can get their mouth on.
Matt, we've had the opportunity, even with my master's work, to sacrifice hundreds of alligator gar. I was working with a commercial fisherman that was going to utilize them anyway. And so we checked the stomachs and did some stomach contents analysis. And yeah, we found that same thing too, is that they eat the most abundant species around, whatever easiest for them to get to. And for us in South Louisiana, that was mullet. And in most places you'll find shad. Yeah, so definitely whatever's most abundant, but they're not picky either, and they'll eat what they can find.
Both of you mentioned marine and freshwater species. One thing that a lot of folks don't realize, and in fact, I didn't realize this until I moved into alligator gar habitat, is that alligator gar can go between saltwater and freshwater, where they're found well up the Mississippi River, but they're found out into the Gulf of Mexico too. How often do they make that movement between freshwater and saltwater?
We've got alligator gar with tags in them that spend most of the year in saltwater. More of a brackish water, probably 3 parts per thousand to 10 parts per thousand salinity. but they will move into freshwater generally in the spring. We're not 100% sure why, but it kind of lines up with that spawning period where they move into pure freshwater up some of these rivers connected to the bay systems. We have seen alligator gar at the very lower end of the bay system of Pensacola Bay, down where it's closer to probably 13 parts per thousand salinity. And we've got from verified sources that they will swim along the Gulf of Mexico out there. If you've ever been to the Panhandle of Florida to Destin or Panama City Beach or Pensacola, we've got these beautiful white beaches and sandbars and clear green water. And we have seen alligator gar swimming along those sandbars right out in front of where everybody's coming to vacation. So salinity is not a barrier to them at all.
I was curious, and my next question was going to be, can they tolerate full-strength seawater? But it certainly sounds like they can. And they certainly can tolerate freshwater for the duration of their life, because the Mississippi fish that you mentioned, the new world record, that was caught in Lake Chotard, which is a small oxbow off the Mississippi River. That fish has probably been trapped in that lake for, if not its whole life, for a large portion of its life. So they're very tolerant of the whole range of conditions. I know they've been found. How far north of the Mississippi River have they been caught?
You mean how far north in their historic range, state-wise?
Well, yes. You wouldn't find them into Minnesota, right?
Sure, they're found in Missouri, found in Illinois. Typically, they were extirpated from that area and have recently been restocked into a few areas. But yeah, traditionally, they would extend all the way up into that Missouri, Illinois area of the Mississippi River.
What are some of the reasons why gar have been struggling? Why are they disappearing from these stretches of their habitat where we used to find them?
They have very specific spawning requirements. So, some fish, you put them in the right situation, they've got the right water temperature, and they're going to reproduce. Alligator gar need to spawn over herbaceous, like leafy vegetation in the floodplain during the certain time of year when the water is warm enough. And the water has to stay in that area long enough for the eggs to hatch and for the fry to be able to swim off before they're high and dry. So as you can imagine, just alone trying to get those types of conditions to all align, that alligator gar may not spawn every year. They may not spawn, maybe once every 5 years. It may take that long for the conditions to be right. And because of that, any kind of human manipulation of the river and its ability to leave the banks and go into the floodplain has a negative effect on alligator gar. Because if the water doesn't leave the river and go into that floodplain, basically leave the bank during the flooding times and flood into a farmer's field or flood the surrounding woods, that's where the alligator gar are going to spawn. So if they can't leave the main river channel, or the water leaves and doesn't, it doesn't stay up high for very long because of various things that we've done to drain those wetlands as fast as possible, all of that stuff has a negative impact on alligator gar.
Certainly. And as most listeners probably know, the Mississippi River, which is one of the primary drainages that the species is found within, has been highly modified. It's flood levees all along the river to try to protect valuable cities and farmland and residential areas that are designed to keep the water in the main channel. So the river, which used to flood naturally, used to spread out miles into bottomland hardwood forests, are now cut off. Most of our rivers have been modified in this fashion, so the alligator gar has been struggling. Memory serves, the Pascagoula River in Mississippi is the only largely unmodified major river left.
Yeah, that's right. And Wes, we've looked at an analysis that shows us available spawning habitat for alligator gar in the entire lower Mississippi basin. And we've definitely identified it as a limiting factor for alligator gar. When you look at the variables, some key variables that alligator gar need to reproduce, to spawn, like Matt was saying, was some very shallow inundated floodplain over terrestrial or some sort of herbaceous vegetation, and warm water, so likely open canopy. When you overlay those conditions in between the levees of the Mississippi River, very, very little spawning habitat is left. And it really highlights how limiting this can be for the population.
That's interesting, Kayla. And in addition to the river regulation that we see on the lower river, and I know you're from Baton Rouge, you see a lot of the levee systems on a day-to-day basis. Once we get upstream past what is it, Cairo, Illinois? Is that where the actual lock and dam structures begin, Matt?
It's in Alton, Illinois, right around the St. Louis area is the last downstream dam on the Mississippi River. But upstream from that, every 5, 10, 15 miles, you have another lock and dam structure. And not only is that a fish passage issue, but that keeps the river basically trained to stay in its channel and not flood out into the surrounding floodplain unless you get extreme rain events, which in the last few years have been happening. But overall, compared to the way it was, a long time ago when Alligator Gar swam freely through that area, it has been modified to the point where they no longer have those natural spawning areas like they had before. So the Mississippi River as a whole, on the upper end, you've got dam after dam after dam. And on the lower end, you don't have any dams, but you do have those levees that run parallel with the river channel and really make that floodplain a lot smaller than it traditionally was before.
So, Kayla, you mentioned that you have modeled potential spawning habitat. Did we find any areas in the lower Mississippi River that still have good habitat?
Yeah, there are areas left. And what we're able to use this tool and this map that we created for is to find areas that are able to be restored. So if we know they actually have good inundation and there's vegetation, maybe they just need a temperature, and that's something we can control. So we look for areas that we can restore using this spawning habitat suitability map. So, again, potentially, maybe it looks like a good area, but it just doesn't have the inundation that it needs. Well, maybe we can make that connection to the river, and we look at ways to do that, to reconnect the river to its floodplain. And some areas that we have modeled and that we know are really good habitat for Alligator Gar are around St. Catherine Creek National Wildlife Refuge in Natchez, Mississippi. It has a direct connection from the Mississippi River all the way to the floodplain. And we find that area really great spawning habitat. I've even gotten the opportunity to see gar spawning out on the floodplain. It was really incredible to see that. So we know what they need. It's just finding those areas left that either are still there or we can restore in some way to make them now work or be available for spawning.
Yeah, that habitat suitability index that Kayla's group has put together is incredible stuff. I mean, you talk about using some cutting edge technology, aerial photography, LiDAR, all of these different things together combined to give you a heat map, basically, of what areas are not good for alligator gar spawning, what areas might be good, and what areas are like perfect. Like just they're bright red on the map, that's where they got to be. And I believe that's what you're talking about, Kayla. You had a spot like that on the map and you actually went out there and witnessed alligator gar spawning. Were able to document it.
Yeah, I was so excited. It was an area I was studying out on the refuge. And when I found the gar and found them spawning, I couldn't wait to get back to the office, pull up the map and drop the pin on the map and use that justification for ground truthing. And sure enough, it popped up in one of the red highlighted areas, which are, Matt said, we're the best.
And I know that we're losing a lot of the coastal marshlands, like around where the Mississippi River empties into the Gulf of Mexico. That type of habitat, that brackish water habitat, is not used for spawning. They only spawn in fresh water.
So I'll say, we've recently finished up a 4-year telemetry study on Delta National Wildlife Refuge in Venice, Louisiana. So this is exactly where you're talking about, Wes. This is the Birdmouth Delta, a really dynamic area where fresh water flows through the estuary and starts to hit brackish until it hits the Gulf. And there's really great population of alligator gar in there. And this all goes back to how you were describing this species has a large range and really dynamic in that it can live in freshwater and saltwater. So it lives in the freshwater and estuary and saltwater areas down there. But they spawn also, and they're spawning in these freshwater ponds. So it's like freshwater pockets that are holding down in these really coastal estuary areas. And the more I've looked at this, and these gar return to these areas year after year after year to spawn. And when you look at some of the maps about predicted land loss, coastal erosion, it's really frightening when you see the amount of land and these freshwater ponds that are going to be lost over the next years. So that is definitely a huge concern that we have, is the loss of these really unique brackish and freshwater habitats down in our coastal areas for those coastal populations of alligator gar.
Yeah, so specifically, I think it's either the egg or the fry that are not able to tolerate salinity. Is that right, Kayla?
Yeah, I think it's both. And I know Suki in 2019, he did the studies down there in Thibodeau for his master's work that showed that up to 6 parts per thousand, the egg and the embryo are okay in that environment. But anything over 6 parts per thousand, they started to see decline, survival, and death. So I think they're going to have to stay in that at least 0 to 6 parts per thousand to have a successful spawn.
So when we look at that habitat suitability index that you guys made for us, it highlights all of our coastal marshes in bright red. Like it should be perfect spawning habitat because it's got that sunlight penetration, it's got the vegetation, it's got the right temperature. But at this point, we probably think the salinity is too high in those areas for them to spawn. But honestly, research on alligator gar is fairly new. Research on coastal populations of alligator gar is extremely new. We have a ton to learn. But we have been trying to find areas farther up the rivers in freshwater environments to try to see these areas that are marked in red on the map and see if we can actually observe alligator gar spawning. That's really the next frontier for alligator gar research in Florida. As currently, we have not observed any spawning going on. We know from collecting fish that we've had spawns in recent years, but we haven't actually seen them spawning, so we don't know 100% where exactly this spawning habitat is at. And for a multitude of reasons, but obviously we'd like to protect that area and make sure that they have it. I think that's probably one of the most limiting resources that alligator gar face in Florida is good spawning habitat. And that doesn't have anything to say that it's been removed because of anthropogenic changes or human activities in the watershed again. I think a lot of it, we're on the eastern edge of their range. You know, there's a reason they don't go any farther east of here. And we don't have these kind of open areas in the floodplain that give you those perfect conditions for spawning. Our floodplain is expansive, but a lot of it is extremely dense cypress trees. And so some of the areas that are marked on these maps are little openings in these cypress tree areas. You know, maybe a hurricane came through and knocked down 1 or 2 trees in an area, which allows that sunlight to penetrate and that vegetation to grow up and make the right kind of spawning substrate that alligator gar need. But it's a very different situation here looking for spawning habitat here compared to where like Kayla is and along the Mississippi River, you know, where they may be spawning out over a flooded farmer's field when they can see miles with a pair of binoculars and they can actually see these giant 100-pound fish thrashing around, making all kinds of commotion. Whereas here we're trying to send in kayaks and canoes to navigate through these cypress areas and getting covered in spider webs, and we can barely see our hand in front of our face, let alone hundreds of yards.
Kayla, what time of year do alligator gar typically spawn?
We found in our coastal populations and more in freshwater populations up the Mississippi, still about the same time, which is in that spring time frame, ranging from late March, April through June. We've really pinpointed down in our coastal population that they return or they show up on our telemetry array in really high numbers every May, like clockwork for 4 years. So we've determined that the conditions, which we know from collecting environmental data, that the water temperature is within an optimal range during that time also, and the salinities are low enough in those areas. So we're definitely pinpointing that that's the spawning time. And again, and it's typically around late May.
You mentioned that they like to spawn in open, shallow areas. Do we know much more about their spawning behavior? I'm assuming that they pair up, or do they spawn in a large aggregation?
One of the neat characteristics of the way alligator gar spawn is that they are in large aggregations. I've seen them up to in hundreds. And so it's quite the production when you see these really large fish that we've talked about how big they can get in that 6, 7 foot, 100 or so pounds. And they're in these big groups of 10s, 50s, however, how many are there, again, in the hundreds. And they're in shallow water, and now they're splashing around and chasing each other. Typically, one female can have up to about 10 males following behind her. Yeah, and so it can be quite the production to see whenever you see these large fish in shallow water splashing and following each other around. And also, I'm going to say something that leaves them vulnerable as a species, because when you put all these gar together. And as we've learned too, is that they have really high site fidelity. They return to the same spawning location year after year after year when it's available and they can get there. It makes them really vulnerable to harvest or overexploitation in some way.
You have to imagine like Native Americans probably keyed in on that as a food source, knowing that they were going to be in this area at this time of year and there was going to be hundreds of 100-pound plus fish in super shallow water. You know, if they could find a way to block off their exit, that would be a food source that would be available to them for a while each year and then again year after year.
Knowing that they spawn in these large aggregations in shallow water and that, as you mentioned, makes them more vulnerable to exploitation, has there been any thought or attempt to protect certain spawning refuges?
One of the national wildlife refuges, St. Catherine Creek, again, which is near Natchez, Mississippi, is the only national wildlife refuge that it is protected on right now. There's no harvest or take of alligator gar, and we have that set because it's a very important spawning location where they are vulnerable. So yeah, there are areas that we've designated as refuge for alligator gar and to protect them. And that's always a good management recommendation, that to protect them during these vulnerable times in that May and June timeframe when we know they're congregating up in these large numbers.
One more question, and then we'll move on from spawning. One thing I've always heard about gar in general, but I believe this holds true for alligator gar as well, is the eggs themselves are toxic to mammals. Is that correct? And if so, what is the evolutionary significance of such a thing?
I find this so interesting. Their eggs are toxic, yes, and that they're toxic to mammals, invertebrates, birds, but not other fish. And so at first thought, you would think, well, why wouldn't eggs that are in the water be toxic to fish? But like you said, evolutionarily, we are thinking that likely it's because of how they and where they spawn in shallow, warm waters, that typically other fish that would prey on eggs, like sunfish and whatnot, typically aren't going to be there. But crawfish or crayfish would be one of the main predators of eggs, and that's why they're toxic to them. And birds, wading birds, but not other fish.
I've always thought that was really interesting as well, the idea that why would eggs be toxic to birds and mammals, but not fish when they're in the water? But as you're right, you know, they're spawning in areas that might be inches to a few feet deep, and more likely they're going to encounter egrets and herons and crayfish. A lot less likely they're going to have abundant sunfish or something in that area feeding on the eggs. So despite the fact we know a lot about their spawning, we know where they spawn, we know how they spawn, one of the problems we're seeing with alligator gar, the numbers are declining, at least within many areas within their range. In general, when you look at them range wide, the northern areas of their range are receding, and the populations within the southern portions of their range are probably not as high as they were historically. Why do we think they're fewer in number? Is it just habitat loss? Is it a combination of habitat loss and harvest? What's going on?
I think you've seen some level of increase in harvest throughout their range as they've become sort of a charismatic megafauna that people really like to target. They're a wonderful opportunity for people that like to bow fish. It's a big, giant critter in shallow water. I don't know if harvest, though, is the only reason. And we talked about habitat losses being the main driver, and I still think that's it. Here specifically in Florida, we don't really see a lot of anglers that would target alligator gar. Now, the harvest has been closed on them here in Florida since 2006, so hopefully we don't see anglers out there targeting them. But just from talking with people over the years, you know, it just never really was a thing around here. There were a few people that liked to bow fish and would target alligator gar when they could, but what they told me is there weren't that many back then even to really target. You know, it was just an opportunity that came along every once in a while. It wasn't, you know, something that they relied on. So we really think our biggest issue here, as I touched on, is our lack of good spawning habitat.
Matt, I think I agree and maybe see some differences over more towards the western part of the range. Definitely agree that our limiting factor for rebounding alligator gar populations is the limited spawning habitat. But we see lots of harvests in the Texas, Louisiana areas. And we do have large populations of gar that are able to be harvested. But we know the fish is very sensitive to overharvest. And there's some new studies out that are getting to exactly how sensitive they are. And this is an area that we just don't know and understand well yet for alligator gar, but are working towards it. But when we just don't know their full abundance and understand how harvest affects it and when they'll get to that tipping point where harvest becomes detrimental or impacts their population in a negative way, I think it still can be a factor in their decline. And really, the perception of alligator gar has changed a lot. It's been like a roller coaster ride of the perception of alligator gar over time. At one point, and this is so fascinating, I think about the management history of alligator gar, state agencies made it illegal to return a gar to the water. They thought that they ate all the sport fish and that they were detrimental to sport fish populations. So they removed them from the water. They targeted them and eradicated them on purpose. I see this image in my head of the electrical gar destroyer, and it was a machine set out to destroy gar. But over time, as we better understand the species and the benefits that these large native predators bring to our ecosystems, they balance the ecosystem, and they're a check to the populations of the fish communities that could be out of control, right? We just said they eat the most abundant fish around. They eat that and are able to control it. So as we learn what a good balance and checks they are to our ecosystem, we perceive them in a better way, right? And we understand them better, and we know that they're really important to our ecosystems.
So how do I get my hands on this gar destroyer?
I think it's been destroyed.
It's interesting, Kayla, because you mentioned that over harvest can have an effect. But when we're talking about harvest, a lot of times we're talking about bow fishing, because if you shoot a gar with a bow and arrow, the chances are that gar is not going to be released alive. Most people that fish for them with a rod and the reel, are they harvesting the fish, or are they practicing catch and release for the gar, just looking for the fight? Do we have any information or studies on that?
I think that's definitely variable in your area and your culture and your population. So I know in Texas that they support and it's highly sought after for trophy rod and reel fishing for alligator gar. But they also set limitations and regulations that help protect trophy size alligator gar. Here in Louisiana, people fish for alligator gar for sustainability. They eat them. It's a sought after fish. If you go to our local seafood market here, Tony's Seafood, they sell alligator gar meat for $5 a pound right now. So here in our culture in Louisiana, people sought after them, catch them, and to eat them. So I think that varies. But I think there is a new study out that shows that some harvest methods like jug lines can be detrimental, and there's more post-mortality associated with that than we have first thought. So I don't know how much is done in other states as far as hook and release just for the trophy, but I know in Texas it is a big thing.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's some level of harvest from anglers when it comes to alligator gar. There was just a email that went out today from Alabama Department of Conservation, basically announcing they had a new state record alligator gar that was caught by a guy bass fishing down in the Mobile Delta. It was 165 pounds officially weighed. It beat the other record by about 12 or 15 pounds. The majority of that article was talking about while the guy is fighting this giant fish that he knows to be an alligator gar, is that while he's fighting it, he wants to eat it because of how great of a story it would make. A lot of folks in this part, and again, alligator gar populations differ so greatly. Over there in Texas, abundance is way higher. It's a completely different situation than we have here. I feel like if an angler around here catches one and it's legal to harvest one and it's a big fish, he's going to harvest it at least once just to say he did it. So I don't think you have a lot of catch and release fishermen in this area, but for sure there's going to be more release through angling than there is bow fishing.
And if either one of you wishes to send me your favorite alligator gar recipe for gar balls or whatever it may be, I'd be happy to post it on the Fish University Facebook page.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Fish University. Do you have a question or a topic for the podcast? If so, you can email me at Wes, that's WES, .Neal, that's NEAL, at Mississippi State. That's MSSTATE.edu. Or instead, please visit the Fish University Facebook page. On the Facebook page, you will find useful articles, videos, stories, and other information, as well as updates on upcoming podcasts. Not to mention, you can send me a private message with questions or suggestions. Just search Fish University and look for our colorful logo. And please follow the Fish University page. We need your support. Now back to the show.
One of the things I wanted to point out was, we talked earlier about how this fish may spawn, maybe it's 10, 12 years old before it's big enough to spawn, and then they may only spawn once every 3 or 5 years. It's not hard to see when a fish is only spawning every 4 or 5 years that you could overfish that population just because they take forever to mature. When they do mature, they don't spawn every single year, so they're not producing large numbers of offspring. It's easy to see how overharvest could occur. Even if harvest is allowed, you need to do a regulated harvest to try to prevent overharvest in those situations.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to me when you look at life history strategies of these different fish species, because they may not spawn every year, it's advantageous for them to live a long time. And what do you know? Alligator gar can live to be over 100 years old. They're a large predator. They need quite a bit of food to attain those sizes. So it also is a good strategy maybe to not have a spawn every year so that they don't eat themselves out of house and home. They were just extremely prolific in creating tons and tons of alligator gar. There wouldn't be enough food to support all of them. So all of it just kind of fits together just perfectly.
Yeah, and Kayla was the one that mentioned that they're an important part of the ecosystem. And if you think about some of the fish species that are out there that people don't like to catch, I'm thinking freshwater drum, common carp. Now we have problems with big-headed carp, the silver carp, and so forth. If you have these large predators that are capable of eating a 20-pound fish, you're much likely to have fewer problems with these more invasive species becoming overabundant. So they are critical to have out there.
Exactly, Wes. I mean, people have looked at alligator gar as a potential biological control for Asian carp, and unfortunately, that ship has already sailed. I mean, those populations have exploded. But think about if alligator gar were potentially in those areas, they would have been one of the few predators that could have efficiently consumed an adult Asian carp. Not to say that would have stopped the initial invasion of Asian carp, but there is definitely potential for that. Unfortunately, in those places where the Asian carp initially made it into, alligator gar may have already been extirpated from that area, or at least there in reduced numbers, reducing their ability to possibly stop that explosion from happening.
And we mentioned earlier, someone brought up bow fishing, and I know bow fishing is a bit of a contentious topic. I think one of the biggest problems I see with bow fishing isn't the fact that we're harvesting fish with a bow. It's that the species of fish that are being harvested are not always utilized. They're doing it more for sport. They're out there targeting all gar species, not just alligator gar, let's say spotted gar or long-nosed gar. If those fish are being eaten like you do with any other harvest, I don't have a problem with that. But it's when you're shooting them for sport and you're taking them out, that's when it becomes a bit more of an issue. And I think the problem, in my opinion, is because people look at what they call rough fish, this term rough fish, as undesirable species. But in reality, those species are important to the ecosystem just like everything else.
The term rough fish, I feel like as natural resource agencies, we kind of perpetuated that idea a lot. Going back to the electric gar destroyer, I've got documents that my agency back in the 80s was supporting gar rodeos, getting people to go out and try to kill as many gar as they could, including alligator gar, because they consume sport fish, or that's what they thought. Rough fish, they don't deserve a place in the lake. You've got carp that are making the water muddy, all of these different things. Let's try to get rid of them so we can only have the fish we want. And I think we've come a long way since then, but unfortunately that kind of mindset still remains, especially with generations that grew up during that time. They're listening to the Fish and Game agencies to give them direction on this. This is pre-internet where they could go and learn a lot of that. So they're leaning on these fish and wildlife agencies to get answers. And when we're delivering misinformation like that, it's no doubt that, they're going to start to think that way too. And it takes a long time for that stuff to kind of change. It takes a long time to change mindsets, but I think we're we're on the way there. And, as far as bow fishing goes, in my opinion, it's a wonderful sport. I've practiced it before. I harvest what I harvest basically and take advantage, whether it's a fish that I think it may not be good to eat. If you treat it the right way and you bleed it immediately and you get it on ice and you give it every chance to be good, a lot of times it's better than you expect it to be.
An interesting aside, Matt, you mentioned carp. The Texas Parks and Wildlife up until recently had on some of their educational materials, they had the common carp. One of the common names was sewer bass.
I've never heard that.
Don't tell that to my old Dutch interns. Florian and Maximilian would not be happy about that. They said if I ever traveled to Europe, they're going to have the carp hole baited up for me. I said, I'm traveling all the way to Europe to go fishing. Maybe we can try for something besides carp.
I'll chime in on the rough fish, because when I think of the term rough fish, you think of a fish that's undesirable for sport or for as a food fish. But that's not at all the case. From everything we've said today, we've talked about what a great sport fish they are and they've grown into, and trophy-sized fish that they're great food fish. They're one of the highest priced fillets, from our local markets right now. So none of that to me sounds like a rough fish. And what we've learned and what we know about the importance of this species to the ecosystem, and even when you think long term, we know that from indigenous people have used them as a food source. They use their scales for arrowheads and plows. They've been utilized in so many ways, and nothing that I see meets the term of rough fish that would be undesirable for food or sport in any way. So I think we've come a long way from that thought and are really changing our understanding and mindset of how we think about this important species.
Yes, and in the last couple of years, there's been a real push within the fisheries profession to try to move away from the term rough fish. So I think we're moving in the right direction for sure. Kayla, I wanted to ask you, I know that the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing a lot of research right now with Alligator Gar. Can you tell us some of the studies that are going on now or that will be happening in the future?
Yeah, sure. So we have a continuous propagation program for Alligator Gar that's actually been going on for about the past 20 years. And so this is an effort to restore populations that their numbers are low or they've been extirpated from. So we'll actually go out to areas of healthy populations, collect the broodstock or parent fish, spawn them, and then put the fingerlings, the little babies, out into areas where we need to restore those populations. So we've been working on that population augmentation for a long time. As far as research goes, kind of in line with the propagation program, we are trying to better understand and work with our state partners to develop a cooperative post-stocking conservation assessment or framework where we better understand and evaluate the success of our stockings, really to help inform adaptive management and future restoration efforts. So that's a really important part of the propagation program that we're digging into in the next few years. In addition to that, currently we are also able to use the bipartisan infrastructure law that was recently signed in November of 2021, which provides funds to restore fish and wildlife passage by removing these in-stream barriers, obsolete dams, and just, as we described earlier, that's really imperative for Alligator Gar. Those lateral movements onto the floodplain, anything that restricts that fish passage like dams and levees, things that we can do to help. We're definitely working on that in the next years of utilizing those funds.
So Kayla, with your hatchery program, you're producing these young gar, you're introducing them back to the native habitats. I know a lot of our listeners may be thinking like the salmon are spawned within a particular river. They set that river in their mentality so that they return to that river. Is there any indication that gar need any kind of navigational cues to return to the spawning grounds, or do they just figure it out as they go because they don't actually leave the main river system? They don't hone into their place of birth, do they?
That's a great question, Wes, and I don't think it's something we fully understand for gar. We've been picking at this a little bit along with lots of other researchers. So we do understand that they have really high site fidelity. So the adults are returning to the same spawning locations year after year. But I don't think there's anything that shows or tells us that they're going to need to return, or they have the cues to return to some very specific area from where they were born. I just don't think that we've found that. Matt, I don't know. Do you?
If they do, we don't know about it for sure yet. And I've got an example of some fish that, some alligator gar that were brought into Florida, down into Central Florida, allowed to be in a research pond there and spawned on their own. So confirmed alligator gar spawning outside of their range without any help from us. So maybe it's advantageous for them to make it back to where they were spawned before because they know those conditions are right. But if given the right opportunity, I think they'll spawn somewhere where they weren't spawned themselves. We see some pretty big movements here again in our Pensacola Bay population of where every single one of the tagged fish that we have all swim 50 plus miles to go back into the Escambia River in the springtime. And we haven't observed them spawning, so we can't say for sure that's why they're going there. But it happens to be between the months of March through June, which are the months that we talked about when alligator gar spawn. And not only do they just swim from the bay into the mouth of this river, but they'll swim 50 plus more miles up to the top of it, up near the Alabama line. So we really think that that's probably an area where they spawn. There's a floodplain there somewhere they're able to get out and spawn. And it's just really interesting, out of the 20 plus fish that we've got tagged, that every single spring, all of them leave the bay and go up the same river. There's multiple rivers they have to choose from in that bay system, but they all go to one river.
Do you ever collect juveniles when you're doing your regular sampling? And does the Escambia River have identifiable spawning habitat?
We've caught fish on the smaller end of the spectrum that are maybe 3 feet long, that are kind of right in there in that size between, whether to call them a juvenile or an adult. I mean, they're a younger fish for sure. The gear we're using has a lot to do with that, though. We're using large mesh gill nets. So a smaller alligator gar is going to be able to swim through that mesh without getting caught up in it.
And Matt, do you have any research or studies going on that you would like to talk about?
Research on alligator gar here in Florida is pretty short. We started back in 2010. So, we're approaching the 15-year mark here. And we did some habitat and movement work on the Escambia River. That was the first river where we had some alligator gar that we could put some transmitters in and sort of follow them around. And we kind of learned what we wanted to learn from that river and decided to move to another river in Pensacola Bay where we had seen alligator gar in the past, but catching them was a lot more difficult. We had a really tough time getting our hands on a couple of fish. And in fact, we had to go over to the Escambia River, collect a couple of alligator gar, put transmitters in them, and then relocate them to the Yellow River, which, in this day and age of us telling people not to move fish may have sounded like a bad idea, but it worked out wonderfully. It took us just a couple of weeks of tracking those fish around before we found them hanging out with a bunch of other untagged alligator gar in the Yellow River, and captured one and got that fish tagged and followed it around and used what we call the Judas fish concept, where, one tagged individual will go and betray his brethren, and then you go and capture those fish and put tags in them. And eventually we got to a point where we could catch fish on a semi-consistent basis. We still don't catch an alligator gar every time we go. I'm really jealous of the folks over in Louisiana and Texas when, they can go out and catch multiple fish every single day. I mean, if we catch one, it's been a great day. We may go days and days and days before we catch one. So it's always a momentous occasion when we do. But we've got enough fish tagged now that we've learned they really don't use that Yellow River. And there's a couple more rivers in that bay system that these fish just don't really go into. They like to hang out in the mouth of the Yellow River and use the bay habitats. And every spring they move to the Escambia River. What we're really looking at now and moving towards is kind of an assessment of the alligator gar population of the entire Pensacola Bay. And trying to get an idea of what's going on there, looking at potential coastal spawning, trying to find actual spawning locations in the Escambia River. That's really where we're moving at this point. Alligator gar as a population, their status is kind of technically called unknown. We're not sure how many of them there are out there. We don't have that many rivers in Florida that have alligator gar in them to begin with. And so we're really trying to go on to each river as a case-by-case basis and really assess what's going on before we can come out and say, well, this fish we know it's rare, but is it really a threatened or an imperiled species? It's too early to make that statement, but we're definitely trending towards that imperiled type status for alligator gar here in Florida. One more thing that we learned about that alligator gar population in Pensacola Bay is we took the genetics from these fish and had them analyzed, and all of Pensacola Bay is a panmictic population, which is a term meaning that they randomly reproduce with each other. So it could be that we've got alligator gar that spawn all over Pensacola Bay, so their offspring are all genetically similar, or it could be there's one place in Pensacola Bay where all of the adults come and meet up and reproduce there, which then again, you end up with all of the fish being genetically similar. So in this situation, looking at both the genetic information we've got and the telemetry results from following around these tagged fish that all end up in the Escambia River, it seems highly likely that the Escambia itself is a location that the majority of the adult alligator gar in Pensacola Bay all meet up during the spawning time to reproduce.
So it's kind of like spring break for gar.
That's right. It's Panama City Beach in the Escambia River.
And Matt, one more thing that we haven't mentioned, but isn't there some issues with people collecting gar for the aquarium trade?
Yeah, they're popular with aquarists. They're a neat species. You know, they're charismatic. They consume live food. They can be colorful. There's definitely breeding programs out there to make leucistic alligator gar, ones that are all white. They appear to be albino. The problem is eventually these critters outgrow whatever container these guys can keep them in. And so then their next move is to release those fish into the wild. And as we talked about, alligator gar can handle wide ranges of salinity. They can breathe air. So putting them in a ditch with no oxygen doesn't matter. They're going to survive. So there's a lot of concerns there with what could happen if alligator gar became established in places outside of their native range, namely Central and South Florida here in my region. Predation or competition with other top-level predators is the first concern that comes to mind. You know, are alligator gar going to compete with snook and other predators like that for forage? I don't think that's the biggest issue. We just know alligator gar have a hard time finding the right conditions to reproduce in. So for them to get to that level of abundance to where they compete with other predators like snook and redfish, I just don't think that's going to happen. One of the bigger issues, though, is we know that they will hybridize with other gar species. We've had confirmed hybrids of longnose and alligator gar in Pensacola Bay. We don't know if they'll hybridize with Florida gar or not. That's another species. That's a native gar species in Central Florida. And when you have a new species like alligator gar introduced into an area with Florida gar, and those two have never had an opportunity to hybridize before, there is a potential there that could happen. That may not mean a lot to sport fishermen, but for people that are interested in kind of maintaining this genetic integrity of our native species, that would be a real problem. And generally in the wild, the majority of those hybridization events are female alligator gar crossed with a male longnose gar or spotted gar. And as Kayla alluded to, when they're reproducing, it's, you know, one female and 7 to 10, 12 males, you know, following behind them, trying to do their thing. And you can imagine as another species of gar, like a long-nosed gar, you know, I see that big, sexy alligator gar female over there. I'm going to try to do my best to reproduce with her. And so, you know, you could imagine a similar situation if alligator gar are outside of their native range because of an aquarium release, or they're brought in for aquaculture purposes, where they could hybridize with other native fish and really dilute that genetic integrity.
I was traveling with a colleague in Vietnam, and we stayed in a small hotel along the Mekong River. And underneath the stairwell, there was a small, shallow cement pool underneath the stairwell. And in that pool was an alligator gar. So that fish had made it from wherever it was either produced or collected all the way to the other side of the world. So certainly these fish are being moved around. That has a lot of risk to it because there aren't gar species currently extant over in Southeast Asia. So that could get into the Mekong River. That could outcompete other species. Let's say some of the big catfish or some of the neat species that are over there. It could cause problems.
Right. I mean, we see it all the time. There's plenty of examples out there of how these exotic species are just terrible and they get put somewhere where they don't belong. And we just try to do our best to keep that from happening and try to educate the public as much as we can and use legislation where appropriate to try to keep that from happening.
What about collecting from the wild? Is that allowed?
In Florida, you have to have a scientific collector's permit to possess an alligator gar, which is another way of saying that only biologists are able to possess alligator gar here. It's currently illegal to possess them, harvest them, or depending on the definition, even potentially target them could be illegal.
Well, Kayla, Matt, it's been a pleasure to have you here today. Thanks for coming on. I enjoyed speaking with both of you about alligator gars. And if anyone has any questions, remember you can always check me out on my Facebook page. It's Fish University. You can send me a private message and we talk about anything you want, or I can post questions to our guests. So thanks, everybody, and thanks for joining Fish University.
Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.